Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I'm your host, Michael Manley, and I want to just say that Empowering Musicians podcast is a place where you can come to learn everything that you need to know about building a career that doesn't involve practicing your instrument. And sometimes I forget to kind of highlight that for people. And I'm very happy to be welcoming this week my good friend, Jim Neglia, to the podcast. And Jim is a percussionist, a professional percussionist, personnel manager in orchestras, as well as a musical contractor in all genres of music, and an author. So welcome, Jim, to the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very nice introduction. And I didn't realize I did all those things, but it's good to hear every now and again.
Yeah. Well, we're here to celebrate that. And so welcome. And why don't you talk a little bit about what you're a percussionist and how you got started as a working musician, and then how you transitioned into hiring jobs?
Sure. I mean, it's a long way back now, but everybody in our family has been musically gifted in some way or another over generations and generations. So it just seemed logical to, be in the music family. And I remember early on, my dad gave me a trombone because my brother was a trumpeter. And that didn't really work very well for me. And as I took the slide out of the trombone, and I had two things, the slide and the trombone in one hand, I started to think, well, that's kind of like drumming. And I think that's where I landed at, with drumming. Yeah. But, we worked hard to do our thing and to move our career along. And my mom especially was extremely supportive in all aspects of what I was doing to move on in my career. And it was my older brother, Joe, believe it or not, when I was in college at William Patterson, where I started. He came to a concert one night. I was playing a piece by Jay Gatch called Night Music. And I was playing like 35 percussion instruments, a drum set, a vibraphone, wood blocks, cowbells, whatever. And he came to the concert unbeknownst to me. And after the concert was over, he came up to me and he said, you're going to New York next year. And that was it. And my brother ruled the house, and I applied to Manus and Manhattan and Juilliard, and I got accepted everywhere. But Manus came through with a scholarship. And at the time it was, vital, obviously. Money was non-existent. But it was through the love, for lack of a better word, and support of the president of the college at the time, who recognized, for whatever reason, early on in my career, that I had some organizational skills. I think those skills come in a way from being a percussionist for me, because my head is always thinking about how do I set up this multi-percussion piece, or so I'm a little bit more detail oriented than some others perhaps. But in my eyes and his eyes, he came to me one day, it must have been in 83 or 84, and said, we have this Taiwanese composer named Ma Shu Long coming in and he has one of his pieces he wants to perform at Alice Tully Hall, and again, a repeat in Washington, D.C. And I think it was 9 players or so. And he said to me, the president of the college said, Jim, put it together. And I didn't understand what all of that meant, but I mean, Michael, you know what this means. It's, okay, I need to get a rehearsal schedule together, find players who are capable of filling those slots, working logistics out with Tully Hall for load-in and for timings and all that other stuff, and then finding transportation, hotels down in D.C. and making all of these arrangements. And I remember after the whole thing being over, realizing that ultimately I saw that was my beam of light that was shining the strongest. And I was driving back home from DC, and I was talking to myself. I remember it in my Volkswagen Rabbit, saying, this is what I want to do with my life. I really like contracting and pulling musicians together and performing. This was the absolute highlight for me. So that's how it all started.
That's a wonderful way to get into that part of the business. And, I'm reflecting on the fact that percussionists, especially principal percussionists, right? You have to be kind of a contractor in some respects already, because you have a piece that has to have 50 instruments played. You've got 5 people, and you've got to figure out like who's going to play this and this bar and this piece and this bar. And, I play in a wind orchestra that's quite good out here in Las Vegas. It's mostly volunteers, but I know this because the conductors like stop and going, okay, where's the chimbasso, right? Or where's the triangle, you know? And so it's always watching these people. It's very different than playing clarinet, where it's like, okay, I'm playing first clarinet, you're playing second clarinet, right? Like,
yeah, no, of course it's much easier that way when parts are assigned, you know, by Calmus, you know, flute 1, flute 2, flute 3 / piccolo, done. But we just get a stack of parts that say percussion on them, you know, without any designation. So at the time when I was really working through all of this, I would have to think, not only do I need, you know, 4 other good players if I'm the 5th, I need 4 players who have the strength to play on specific instruments that are in, you know, in the battery, you know, and doing currently in the past 10 years, you know, with the Cine concerts and other companies, doing movies has become huge. But the thing that, you know, Danny Elfman scores music one way and all these other composers score very thick for percussion. And, you know, sometimes a player's ability to cover the mallet instruments is stronger, and other people play membrane instruments, snare drums and tom-toms. Others play accessories. And it's just knowing who to pair together. And that's the job right there. And if I could segue for a second as a result of that, as a freelance contractor, when I started in the 80s, I would always pick my 17 principals. You know, each of the sections were covered, and I'd build the orchestra from there. From each principal, then who's going to sit associate or assistant with them, and then build a section back from there. And I always found they were always good players in New York and New Jersey. That it was a non-issue, but it was the chemistry of putting specific people together that really was the je ne sais quoi, you know, the real meat and potatoes of the contracting. And it was a learning curve. But once I started to get it, I mean, really get it, my success as a contractor started climbing very quickly. And it was a very interesting journey, the beginning part. After that, the floodgates kind of opened up out of being in the right place at the right time. And I think that has a lot to do with it as well.
Yeah. Well, you touched on something that I think I always, and I learned this working within the American Federation of Musicians on kind of the union contract administration side of things. And just seeing, you know, people in trouble, let's say, or that are in hot water. And it's almost when I've seen people that, you know, unfortunately sometimes got fired from jobs. It was almost never because of musical reasons. And it was always because they just weren't a good colleague or couldn't get along with other people. And so I always try to tell people, like, you do have to be a skilled musician, but that's not the only requirement. You actually have to, like, be a good person and know how to work with other people.
You're hitting the nail directly on the head. And I'll share that in most of the orchestra world, even when it comes time to talk about tenure for a new player, although the personnel manager really has no say in the artistic side of the player, invariably the music director will bring me into the room first and say, have you had any issues with this player? Have they been a good colleague? Do they show up on time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Because that's part of the whole ball of wax. It just is. And it's a fact. And I've seen people lose their positions because of their attitudes. So in personnel manager world, we're not allowed to have a bad day. So I try my best always to smile and keep going. But it becomes challenging. It really does. So.
Yeah, and especially in that orchestral realm, it's such a weird thing because if you're not a musician or you're watching this and you're wondering how this whole world works, like you will practice in a room by yourself. You'll go to an audition where you'll be sequestered into a practice room. You'll play behind a screen. And then if you're lucky enough, you'll be hired, but nobody has any idea who you are or how you play with other people or how you interact with other people. So it's a very odd process of selection. And then you can't figure out those things until somebody's on the job, really.
Yeah, and that's what the tenure process is for, or the probationary period, et cetera. And I personally like to have the orchestra, the members, the people who are auditioning behind the candidates behind the screen. This way, you're bringing somebody in solely on what your ears are telling you. And that's a beginning, but it's only a beginning, you know, and then the rest of it happens there. But one of the jobs, one of the I don't want to say job, but one of my goals every time a new member wins a position in my current orchestra and in past orchestras, my number one goal was to get them tenured. My number one goal was to nurture them and to encourage them and to say, hey, maybe you want to make a right instead of a left, or zig instead of zag. And you know, this is where we want to head, and really try to encourage them. And most of the times they're open to it, because musicians, as we all know, all have a different sensitivity, you know, just to their instruments and their colleagues, as maybe other workers in other fields might not have the same. I'm not saying they don't have it, but what we do is very emotional at times. And I could play any Mahler symphony and have goosebumps coming off my arms that I can't even breathe. I'm so excited to be performing. And I think that now that I'm off the stage, I carry that same energy about helping others. And I always figured if we can create an environment that is really conducive with the highest performance level for a musician, we've done our job. And we've created this place where they can just go and excel and not worry about, you know, being encumbered in any way, and just being able to perform on their instrument. So that's my duty.
Yeah, absolutely. And
long-winded, Michael, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it's really key, because the personnel manager, you know, it's kind of an elusive job from the outside. Not a lot of people understand. It's like, well, yeah, they're making the schedule. They're making sure that substitutes are covering parts that aren't being covered by their principals or their regular players. But there is this kind of other part of it that's about, how do I help people succeed in not just playing their instruments, but in fitting into the orchestra and fitting into a structure and maybe an aesthetic. In the case of certain orchestras, I mean, like you think about the Cleveland Orchestra, it's like that's an orchestra that has a very particular sound that they've and culture that they've kept for you know, decades. And it's like it's part of your job to sort of make sure that people are doing all of that work as well as playing really well.
It really is true. And it's like I said, if we create the environment, what was the old movie? If you build it, they will come. If you create the environment, most people will react to it. You know, I would say in the high 90%, they will react to it. And, you know, I wrote in one of my books that I walk into work like with a spring in my step, and I kind of bounce around, and I try to be jovial and happy. And it bounces off into the players. They feel it. On the off chance, and I've had these days in my life where I come into work and I'm not having such a good day, it's funny, nobody comes near me. It's just, they're like, what happened to Jim today? Well, they could really feel it. And that makes the weight on my shoulders that much heavier, which I accept, by the way. And it serves as a reminder, Michael. I think that's really what it is. Hey, I have to be on 100% of the time, not 99% of the time. I really need to be, but I am human also.
Yeah. I do want to talk to you while we're in the symphonic part of this work.
Sure.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what's on sort of, and it's late to the table, but finally orchestras are waking up to the idea that we have to be more inclusive and diverse and representative of everybody that we serve. And so I always, again, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I was always thinking about that, not only in terms of like the personnel, which is how the industry was focused then, I think, but also like, we should also talk about the music we're playing. And so, and not just focus on the diversity of our personnel, but like the diversity of our music and everything else. So how is your orchestra that you're working with now, which I believe is the Jacksonville Symphony, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a great question.
How are they dealing with that? And then what is your role in that process as a person?
Yeah, I mean, that's just, I mean, you know, there's so many layers to that question, but I'll peel away at one or two, and then we can dive down the rabbit hole if you like. But as far as DEI or all this diversity that's been happening, we've partnered up with the Sphinx organization, and we have an amazing relationship now with them. And we've been fortunate that we've gotten grants that help support the diversity, and the symphony is recognized as one of the leaders down here in the South of doing these things and the initiative that we've taken. And I'm very proud of that. I have a lot to do with it, but I also have great leadership from above me, who, you know, that we work together with our CEO, my general manager, all people I'm very proud to be working with. As far as our music director, Maestro Lewis, his vision, it seems, and I don't want to speak for him, but we want to do all new works, a lot of new works, 3, 4, 5 a year. The symphony's commissioning works, and so forth. So we have our hands all over the place with very diverse music and programming and so forth, that I think they all layer on each other. So if we could diversify the stage and we diversify the music, we diversify the audience, we diversify, the outlook of the entire association. So I just play my role in that regard of saying, okay, I need to augment the orchestra by X, Y, and Z. If you have a core orchestra of 60 people, which is what we have here, and we have 75 on stage, I'm adding 15 members to a given week of work. So I like playing that part. And there was a little period of time where I said, maybe I won't contract anymore, and I'll let my assistant personnel manager do it, because my bigger job is really, I keep the wheels greased and moving, and hiring takes a lot of time. We have a 40-week season, and we do 53 different series within a 40-week period. So wow. About 300 services a year. Talk about diversity. We can go from a Pops concert to a Shostakovich 10 to Beatles, all in 1 week. It's just what it is. Yeah. But this is what keeps me busy and hopping along. But I ultimately told my assistant, if I need you to help me out with this, I'll let you know. But I like being the face. I like being the voice of the symphony, no matter where I'm working. And I think that I like to have a connection with each of the players who come in, especially new players. It's, you're gaining a new family member, and you want to treat them as such and respect them as such. So I hope I answered at least some of the question.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. And I think the Sphinx organization, I'd love to have somebody from that organization on my podcast, actually. I think you'll have to connect me to them, because I'm not sure I have many connections there. But
the gentleman who runs it up, his name is Bill Neary, and he is the sweetest, nicest individual I think I've worked with in my career. And I met him in Cincinnati at a conference last summer, the summer before. And although I understood his message and the message from Sphinx, he was a guest speaker for the personnel managers. And he made an absolute impact in my thinking and my understanding on a much deeper level. So I applaud him and what he's doing.
Yeah. It's been interesting for me, because I actually still take auditions, believe it or not. And the reason I do it is because if you don't have like a lot of regular work or a regular gig, it's very hard to motivate yourself sometimes. And auditions are a great way to get back into shape and to do all of that. But what I've noticed is that it's still a very interesting process. And what I've noticed is that there is still a financial component to it, right? You still have to physically get yourself to an audition. Sometimes what I've noticed is that there'll be an opening advertised, you'll send in a resume, and maybe only a month before the audition they'll get back to you, and it's like, well, it's too late to buy a plane ticket now. Like, what's going on with this? So there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm surprised that with technology the way it is, we haven't figured out a way to remove that financial barrier from applicants.
There is, Michael. It's such a great point that you bring up. We're here in Jacksonville, it's kind of a no man's land. We're not in Southern Florida. We're not in Atlanta, 5-6 hours away. It's kind of, we're on this little island in a sense, especially after leaving New Jersey, where I could make a phone call at 8:30 in the morning and have a player on stage by 10 a.m. It's easy. Yeah. Down here, I don't have the same depth. I've got wonderful players, but not the same depth. Mm-hmm. We've looked into, there's a lot of platforms now that, and some orchestras, I believe Milwaukee and others have already used them, where they have the first round not live. It's live, but the player is at home in their studio. And so if the quality is there, then it's worth inviting them to the semifinal round. So I think that the industry will probably move towards that. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I think that's where it's going. Yeah.
Well, that's really important. And I think people that maybe just support their symphonies and they're attending and they love to go to their concerts, they don't think about these things, right? Like
no, of course not. Of course not.
Yeah. I mean, not to say like, and to say nothing about the average, right? Like the idea that like you've got 100 people, 200 people vying for one position. And then to do that 4 times a year, how much is that going to cost somebody over a year?
But even the organization, Michael, it costs the organization a lot to host auditions. To put an ad in the IM is, you know, roughly $1,000 for a small ad. I mean, I'm not complaining about it, but there's an expense renting the hall, making sure the music director's in town, you know, having some food for the people who are working backstage, take care of your committee. I mean, there's a lot involved with it. And they all carry an expense, and then what we're trying to do away with, I think, in our case, is to even have trial weeks, because trial weeks become incredibly expensive. To bring a player in for a week could cost, you know, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, including salary. So you do that 3-4 times a year, you know, on top of the audition, you're looking at a great deal of money. Plus, if you have 2 candidates who are vying for the same job, and it was all behind the screen, and you don't know if they're short, tall, fat, skinny, black, white. It's just a player. Once they come in, it's either, do I want that one or that one? And it has to play into the thinking. Even if we don't want it to, our subconscious has to go. It gravitates one way or the other. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah,
that's a problem. We have to get through. We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's funny. Auditions are extremely they're extreme. It's a meritocracy, right? It's extremely objective, but it's also just so inefficient. Like, I'm just thinking about people on committees that have to listen to 50 people in a day playing 5 pieces of music, and just, you know, that's a challenge in itself as well. But there's no better way to do it, really, that I can see.
I can't think of anything else either, you know, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And you're also doing theatrical contracting and commercial contracting as well.
I've been super blessed in my career. And I'll tell you, for anybody who's listening, if you think by the time you hit 50, it's all over, it's going downhill, like you've reached your plateau of where your life is, I will tell you that is not true. So about a decade ago, through a mutual acquaintance that I ran into, that I went to college with years before, a wonderful conductor, she and I crossed paths, and she said, I'm doing The Legend of Zelda at the NJPAC. I mean, this is a decade ago. And I said, what the heck is The Legend of Zelda? I had no idea what she was talking about. And she said, well, I'm conducting this video thing, and, you know, we have an orchestra and so forth. And I said, that's interesting. At the time, I said, you're in my house, you know, at the NJPAC in New Jersey. And I said, do you need an orchestra? She said, yeah, I just don't have a contractor. And I said, well, I said, do you know that this is what I do as part of my living? She then introduced me to the owner of the company who was producing the tour. And we had lunch together, and I made him a proposal to take over all 30 cities that the tour was scheduled for. And he said, let's do the first four or five, just so, you know, I could get to understand how you work. And within like 4 or 5 days of producing budgets and lining things up, I think he realized, well, this young man might be good at this job. And as a result of that, HBO got involved and Live Nation got involved, and my name started to morph out of nowhere into, you know, the Who tours or Hugh Jackman or Game of Thrones. And I can go down the list of that, but it's self-serving, so I won't. But the fact is that the amount of work that was coming in early on snowballed into allowing me now to, you know, put my sticks on the shelf and retire from my performance life and really focus more, aside of the Jacksonville Symphony, which is my big job. I have 4 or 5 tours out right now that I'm working on, and it's been a really, really fun ride the past 10 years. So it's never too late. I'll be honest with you, it's never ever too late.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you know, artists of all stripes tend to work really long into their careers because they love what they do, right? You know, there's a lot of people who are like, oh my God, I can't wait till I hit 65 so I can retire. go to my vacation house or whatever. But yeah, we love what we do, and I think that's a wonderful aspect of our work. So let's talk about how you're hiring for, let's say you're doing a tour of, I don't know, Zelda or Game of Thrones. You're hiring local orchestras in 60 different cities, let's say, or 30, or how is that what you're doing?
So I'll get a list of cities. Okay, there's a staged process of what takes place, which I adore, and I love the process for whatever reason. Maybe it appeals to the way my brain works or the way I'm wired. I'm not quite sure, but I get a list of all the cities and the dates and where the venues and everything that I would need. The size of the orchestra. Let's say for Game of Thrones, it was 33 players, if I remember right. There were 3 horns, 3 low brass, and the rest were strings, so it was kind of easy on my end. And the tour carried their percussionists and their backline. The backline means, amplifiers, keyboards, drums, whatever it means. I was not responsible for that, which was at the time a blessing. Yeah. That'll come up later, however. And then I hired gyms everywhere in the country, in the cities that we're going to, and I umbrella those contractors. And my title then gets elevated to music coordinator, because for lack of a better word, I didn't know what else to call myself at the time. So I was coordinating all of my contractors, gathering budgets, calling the local unions and finding out and double checking prices and making sure that everything was on the up and up, so to speak. It's easy when a tour is coming through town that contractors and musicians think it's a big cash cow and they can kind of siphon off as much money as they can. And I get it. I understand the optics of it, but it's a business like anything else that's out there to make money. So we sell this product, and the product has to be at a marketable value in order to make money. So that's basically all of those pieces of the puzzle are in my head, and I thrive on it for some reason. And it energizes me to get on the phone with my contractors or send them follow-up emails. And we have this camaraderie around us because we're all doing the same thing. And it's just a fun process. I just enjoy it so much.
That's great. And then how do you identify those contractors in these various different cities around the country that you want to work with? There's so many ways. There's so few ways, I should say, but the few ways that I have are really solid. And I've been blessed again to work with other contractors who are a bit my senior. And when I say a bit my senior, I'm talking by 10 years. So they're not very old either. But I drew on my number one guy, who is still an amazingly valued friend and colleague, is Michael Keller. And Michael Keller has since retired from contracting. But Michael Keller is never leaving the links. He's playing golf all the time now and enjoying his life. And I still call Michael up, and we still, BS about this and that. But when Michael was music coordinator, while I was contractor of the NJPAC, we got to know each other very well. Michael Keller did the Barbra Streisand tour when Hamlish, we're talking in the 80s, I believe. Yeah. But Michael, then I would say, hey, Michael, I got this opportunity. Do you have anybody in Phoenix? And he'd go, oh, yeah, you have to call Christina. Do you have anybody out in Kansas City? Yeah, you have to call Mike McGraw. And it just went on like this. And finally I said, Michael, why don't you just give me your Rolodex? And he showed his whole Rolodex at me. It was the most amazing thing. And Michael and I, like I said, we've stayed in touch. But just recently, I'm looking at different paths forward with different cities. And now that I've been doing this for roughly a decade plus, I have a lot more knowledge. I try to go to the opening of every show that we do. So and it usually starts in San Francisco or in LA. We have some that open in London. I try to stay out. I do stuff in Europe, but it's more expensive for me to go to Europe than here in the States. But I've got to meet people firsthand, and then they introduce me to other people. You meet production managers and so forth and so on. And these are established halls. If I went to Carnegie Hall and I said, hey, do you have a local contractor? I bet I can get 5, So that's the way I network that. And it's worked out for me so far. I've hit a few snags here and there, but generally speaking, it's been a smooth process. That's great. I do want to ask the previous question about this realm as well, right? So here we have a different way that people engage with the work and get hired, right? So we're not in the symphonic realm. We're not behind the screen. We're not auditioning. So how do you ensure and stay sensitive to DEI work in this non-open hiring situation with contracting?
It's a great question. And I don't know if I have a real direct answer for it. However, I have to be careful what I say now. There have been some projects that I've done that have been for very high profile clients. And I don't talk about the $1 million clients. I'm talking about the $1 billion clients who have said to me, we want to fit a certain demographic in our on stage that you're going to produce. And, you know, I spend a lot of time on social media, you know, looking at players maybe I don't know, but have great look that I think, and then I see what they've been doing in their career. And it takes me hours, if not days, to pull together 25 players to get approval by the $1 billion companies to say, that's the demographic we're looking for. You know, every ethnicity, you know, so I like that these companies want to be that diversified. But in the beginning, I felt like it was a big weight on my shoulders of, you know, I'm discriminating perhaps against another player. But in fact, with DEI, the way it's turned in the past 10 years, it's really the reverse. We're encouraging, we're helping, we're bringing to the stage a diverse look. You know, it's supposed to look like, our stage should look like our audience. You know, that's the idea. So yeah, it's challenging, but I get it. I got it on a different level now. I hope I answered, Michael.
Yeah. Well, we've got some great comments coming in. Betty King says, great point, Jim. Orchestra members are our family. We have another user saying, so wonderful to hear and see Jim on this show. And then we have another question for you, Jim, which is, does Jim have any advice for an aspiring contractor personnel manager, especially for a working musician who wants to get into it? Also, how did Jim balance his performing career with his contracting career?
Well, I mean, those are all loaded questions, and thank you. First of all, I'm intrigued, of course. Again, I don't know if it's because I'm a percussionist, but I'm wired in such a way where I can literally separate my two roles, and it's vital that you're able to do so, in my opinion. If I took everything that I heard from disgruntled employees, whether they're musicians or staff or partners of my staff, and I took it to heart that it was Jim, I would have left the business long ago. But I know it's the position that sometimes bears the brunt of the uncomfortable situation, whatever it may be. And as a personnel manager, as a contractor, as a human, as a husband, as a dad, I can't allow that. I have to meet the challenge for each player. And I've learned over the course of my career that if a player really feels violated in some way and they bring it to me and I think it's really nothing, it's still something to that player that I must address, I must resolve, and I must take care of. So in the early career, moving from playing and contracting together, I would tell my music director early on, could you not have the percussion on the first piece of the rehearsal, because I need to get back into the section. And they never listened to me. But the section would have my instruments. I'd set up when I'd get there early in the morning, and they'd have my music open. I would tune the orchestra at 9:59 and a half, and I'd run to the back of the section, you know, for 10 o'clock, and I would just get ready to play and do my thing. But it was challenging because, you know, while I was busy augmenting the stage and doing my other job, I needed to be practicing and warming up and, you know, running through West Side Story again, or, you know, Candide or whatever it may be, and keeping my chops up. So it was challenging, but, you know, you can do it. It's doable. You just have to separate one job from the other.
Yeah. There's, you know, I had Scott Faulkner on a few weeks ago, who is a bass player who was also the executive director of his orchestra. And so that's an even weirder combination, being a player who's also an executive director. But you're right, it can be done.
Let me tell you something, though, Michael. When I started my career off, not as a contractor, because that was in the late 80s, but as a personnel manager, which was much later. And they are very different jobs. Personnel managing and contracting, night and day, although joined somewhere, but they're very different jobs. I don't know. I didn't know if I wanted to transition at the time. I liked being a contractor, and I didn't know if I wanted to be beholden to a collective bargaining agreement that put more pressure on my shoulders. But as I learned more and more, I realized it was a good merger, and it just worked out that way.
Yeah, that's really good feedback. And so, as far as the first part of this question, what advice would you give for somebody who wants to do this work, and how do they break in, and what makes them succeed?
I think I would go to the, sometimes people come to me and say, I want to get into arts administrating, or I want to learn how to, I really have a desire to, to do what you do. And I say to them, you know what, come in next week and ghost me for a day, and like, let's spend the week together. Let's spend the day together. And I said, maybe by the end of the day, you don't want to do what I'm doing, or maybe you do. But I would go and ask the established personnel manager or contractor these questions that are close to home. You may find out that they're looking for some assistance in some way. And even if you break in a little bit, it's worth it. It's difficult for somebody who does what I do to try to break somebody else in, because by the time I break them in, I could already accomplish what needs to be done. However, as I'm getting older, I'm starting to look to break people in and this is exactly what Michael Keller did with me. It's exactly what he did. He knew he was phasing out, and he phased me in with the billion-dollar companies. And I don't know if you know Michael Ahrens, but Michael Ahrens took over from Mike Keller on the Broadway scene. And he's a genius, Mike Ahrens. He's a wonderful guy. I would recommend interviewing him. He's just a delight.
Yeah. That's a good one to add to my list. Yeah.
But this is the way that Michael put his feelers out and latched onto me and the other Michael. And that's another way of progressing in the business. The other thing is that a lot of orchestras, there's been a lot of turnover in the country. And if you're willing to move or uproot yourself, as I've done later in life, there's even more opportunity out there, I believe. I really do. It's hard to get good personnel managers and good assistant personnel managers, and they're vital to our industry.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And shadowing somebody who's already doing it, I think, is key. I think one question I always try to ask people that do hiring is, and I think it's changing now, but like, how do folks get on the radar of, if not you, somebody else who's hiring in Phoenix or in Dallas?
Sure. You remember in the old days when there was just tons of work on Broadway in New York, and a lot of musicians would wait outside the stage door, and they'd wait for the percussionist or the trumpet player or the violinist to walk and say, hey, I'd really love the opportunity to sub on your show. And that was one way of doing it. And I don't disagree with it necessarily. I think that there's a million different methods to get from A to B. I always wanted to wait for things to happen more organically in my life. And perhaps I missed a few opportunities because I was more reserved. Believe it or not, I was more reserved. Yeah. But I think that again, shadowing, and ask me the first part of this question. I just went off on a different thing in my head. I apologize, Michael.
No, just like, some contractors don't want you to call them. They're going to be turned off if you reach them on social media. And how do you get on their radar, I guess?
I would say go through the principle of the section. Go through the principles. If you contact your principals and just say, hey, here in Jacksonville, we have a new concertmaster, and she's a wonderful, Adelia Nartadieva. And what we do here is I get all the time emails from people, I'd like to come and sub with the orchestra. And I say, hey, do you have any MP3s? Do you have any YouTube videos? I'd like to share them with my concertmaster. I'd like to share them with our principal percussionist, or whatever section is affected. And that starts to bridge the gap very quickly, because a talented player, I mean, someone who's really at a very high level, they will move up the list very quickly. I've witnessed it many, many times in my career. I recommend it actually highly. Go through the principle. It's also the right thing to do. It's the right approach. You're not going to the contractor who then has to go to the principal. You're going right to the person who's giving the list to the personnel manager. Here's my list. Hire accordingly. That's not up to us. For everybody out there, it's not, I don't get to hire who I want. I get to hire who the principals rank on a sub list, and that the music director then approves. So there's a whole, as a contractor, I could do anything I want. That's the difference. One of the differences between contracting and personnel managing as well. My gosh, I can go on forever.
Yeah. Well, that's really good feedback to hear. Let's talk a little bit about some, I know you've written a few books, and in your books, you've shared some of maybe situations where things didn't go so well. So do you have any great stories for us about work nightmares or just other things that would be fun to share?
I mean, aside of, piano lids falling down in concerts and snare drum heads breaking at the end of Bolero, I mean, I've witnessed everything, and I've been a part of it. And or the string on the xylophone just coming loose and the bars going down so they wouldn't respond in the middle of a concert. It just happens. And I think part of getting from A to B is how do you respond from that? And if you could bounce back from that, that's pretty darn good. But there was one, we were in Europe, we were in Spain, in a little town called Girona. And it was full orchestra and all like that. But we had an electronic keyboard player and a bass player to play some more contemporary works for our friends in Spain. And the bassist forgot his cable, the converter, to hook up to the bass so he could use his amplifier. We have an hour to go before the rehearsal or whatever it was. So I went down to the local store, to see what I could find. And I found somebody who spoke broken English, very good Spanish, and some Italian. So we were able to converse together. And we put together like 3 different gadgets to put in the American plug. So I buy everything for the player. I bring it back. And I'm watching. I would 1/4 of the eye, but I'm also looking at my clock. We're running out of time. We need to start on time. All the pressures. The poor guy puts the things together in the opposite of what I instructed him to do. And as he was going to plug it in, I'm saying, no. He plugged it in, the whole thing shorted out. We had no bass for the concert. That was it. Oh, so man. You live through everything. There's nothing that I can't think of a thing that hasn't happened, although I'm sure there are many things waiting to happen. But I do write a lot of these stories, especially my first 2 books, which really share how I got from 12 years old, where I had my first set of drumsticks, to about 50 years old, where 10 years ago when I wrote the first one. So there are really great stories in there, and they're just a couple pages long each. And I promise you, if you read any of them, you will laugh, and you will cry, and you will enjoy, and you'll ponder, and you'll do all of those things. So there's some good stories in there.
Yeah, I look forward to digging into those. We all have some version of those in our careers because we work on a live performance art, right? Yeah.
Everybody that I've spoken to, especially after the first book, said, I lived through that. I get it. I know I've done that. That's happened to me before. And that was very encouraging for me to write the second one, the third one, and the fourth one, because I figured if I lived through all of this, so have all of you. And it's really true in life. We all live through the same stuff with different names and places. It's all the same.
Yeah. I had the privilege of touring with the New York City Opera for many seasons. And my very first season with them, we did Tosca. And it starts with a sort of priest on stage singing, and the church bells go off, and then he delivers a prayer. And we had a percussion sub in, and somehow the chime was like hitting the floor. So the first chime just sounded like dropping a fork. Oh. And then he hit another chime, which was the wrong pitch. And the conductor was like, F, and the whole orchestra is like trying to play with tears coming out of their eyes because we're all laughing so hard.
Of course.
And it was brilliant, though.
As you remind me about chimes, in the Tchaikovsky, in the Nutcracker suite, I think at the end of the first act or beginning of the second act, there's 12 chime notes, for the clock. And yeah. I would always have to play it, and I would get to like 10, and I'd slow my tempo down a little bit, and the conductor would say, "Give me 12." I could see his eyes. Make sure you give me 12, but I would do a little retardando, a little slow down. And I would sometimes gamble and say, maybe I'll give him 13, maybe I'll give him 11, because I knew he was counting. But I didn't. I played my 12.
That's great. Excuse me. Somebody's asking, and again, if you're commenting and you haven't set up StreamYard the way it works, I can't identify who you are, but thank you for your comments, all of you. Slightly off topic, but Jim has a wonderful book about composers, visiting cards, and signatures. How did Jim get into collecting?
Oh my gosh, thank you. Whoever you are, thank you. I am so proud of this book. I've written 4 books. The one about visiting cards is it's really a historical book, as the comment shares. I was in Vienna touring with the Czech Radio Symphony. It was right after the revolution, 1989, where Czechoslovakia split up, no bloodshed, everything fine. And I started working there through a client in New York. Long story short, I wound up spending most of my summers there and a lot of time during the year. And one day in Vienna, we had time off, and I stumbled along this this shop, and I walked in, and there were just these books. What were they? Binders sitting on the counter, and it said, A to C, D to F, et cetera, et cetera. And I opened it up, and it said, Respighi, Pines of Rome, clarinet quote from the 3rd movement. And I said to the proprietor, can you please bring me some of these things? And they were actual letters by the corresponding composers, and there were letters from Schoenberg, from Dufaya, you name it, anybody you could think of. And I'm sitting there holding these documents in my hand that were written, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever it may be. And I became incredibly fascinated that this was one unique letter. There were no duplicates. There's only one of these. And I felt compelled to buy a bunch of articles at the time. It was when the dollar was super duper strong. I mean, really strong. And the shilling was still strong, but not like the US dollar back in the early 90s, 91, 92. And I wound up buying a good amount of material from there. And little by little, I started to find these visiting cards from composers, like literally your calling card. And so imagine someone you meet, Brahms meets somebody at a show, at a performance, and Brahms wants to go back and meet them again. So he takes a visiting card. He says, hey, we met last night at the such and such show. He knocks on the door. The servant puts his silver plate down. The visiting card goes on there, and they bring that to the person that Brahms wants to see. I have that card now. That's my interest. I want to own those cards. And I now have the largest collection, not in the United States, but in the world, of visiting cards. And during the pandemic, I decided I'm going to write a 19th century visiting card book that highlights, I think it's roughly 120 of the top instrumentalist composers, etc. And I'm super proud of this book, super, super proud of it. It's probably the book that has sold the most because it's a crossover of autograph collecting, visiting cards, 19th century composers. It covers a whole genre. And when you open the book, Michael, it's each composer is just one full page. On the left side, it'll be the composer with his dates and a picture, which I've gotten permission from lots of different societies to use a fixed picture. And then some anecdote. Not something that everybody knows, but something that I really dug down deep to find about the composer. And then on the flip side of the page was the visiting card with complete translation. Whatever the language was, everything was done. And that was my presentation. So anyway, that was the long way around of saying I got into it because of Vienna and the Czech Philharmonic, the Czech Radio Symphony.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And I had no idea what a visiting card was. So it's almost a precursor to a business card, right? It was like,
it is. Hey, it is. It's still a business. Yeah. And again, I have everybody, I just keep buying them. I can't help myself. Yeah. But I love them. I love them all. But I also have a wonderful collection of letters of Tchaikovsky, of Brahms, etc. And I think one day they'll just get passed down to my kids because I don't think I'll ever sell them. I collect them because I love them. And I'm very passionate about this aspect of holding an original item in my hand that there's only one of. It's not a facsimile, it's the real thing. So I find it very intriguing.
That's amazing, and would be a great gift to any museum or archive as well.
I agree.
By the way, yeah. By the way, that was Donato who was asking that question. So thank you, Donato, for watching.
Donato.
It's great to have some other folks who have been guests on the show watching the show, and I know you and Donato worked together at the New Jersey Symphony years ago.
We did. I loved working with Donato.
Yeah, yeah. So thanks for watching, Donato. Any other fun stories you have? And I wanted to talk a little bit about hiring in terms of somebody being right for a certain role. So you might have like the greatest trombone player who is the best person to have for Mahler 3, and you might need to hire somebody else for Chicago, the musical, when it's coming through.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So yeah, there are crossover players. That's another great topic, is that sometimes, you know, for any player in any one of the sections, I used to break down my rosters in New York and New Jersey, where we played a piece by Duke Ellington called Harlem. And if my memory is right, the two players that stick out the most is I needed a trombone player who can play over changes. Mm-hmm. And I needed a trumpeter who could scream, you know, a high trumpet player. And we all know who those players are in New York. I mean, and I used them, and I was grateful to have them working with us. But I would not put those same players if we were playing Mahler 3, mm-hmm. because that's not the quality of the sound that the symphonic world is looking for. Although they might be capable of it, I don't want to take away from that. It's not where my ears put them. But yeah. I've been wrong, Michael, in my career before, where, you know, I had somebody pegged as a certain, you know, in a certain box, and I got caught, you know, with my pants down for not having a player and calling him at the last minute, say, hey man, can you cover this? And they come in and they knock it out of the park. And I said, oh my God, I had no idea that, you know, they did both so well. So I have to be very careful. But if I hire a player and I say I need a principal trombone for Mahler 3, and the player's very smart, they'll say, Jim, that's not what I do. You know, mm-hmm. They will put themselves in that position as well. So I try to get the player to be, you know, we have a respectful relationship together, and I try to place them where they're the most solid. That's a great question. That's a great question.
Yeah, yeah. So, and Bill Marthalak is saying, I really enjoyed today's guest. It was enlightening. Thank you. Bill is my only super fan. I feel like Bill's watching every week.
Thank you, Bill.
Bill's a former union official from our Pittsburgh local AFM, and I'm sure a former musician as well. So thank you, Bill, for keeping your eyes on the podcast.
Could I share one other thing, if I may?
Sure.
It was something that happened to me that had repercussions to it, and mm-hmm. and it wasn't my doing, but the optics of it looked like it was my doing. So let me explain for a second. Sometimes I'll get called for a tour, and let's use the Who tour for a moment. What did we do? 2019 was the first one, and I did a lot of cities with that. And Keith Levinson, who I adore, the music director, and also he was the orchestrator of all the parts for the Who show. When I got hired through Live Nation to do these, he got in touch with me and said, here's the list of players you're going to hire. So he already had his orchestra in mind, which I have no problem with, except for when my players, who I'm very loyal and very faithful to, said, Jim, the Who's coming. We have 10 dates. And I say, I'm sorry, I can't use you. There was real pushback. I mean, and I tried, you know, I'm not going to try to explain to everybody how I work or how it is, but there is a whole, if something goes wrong, chances are it's something that's out of the control of the contractor or of the personnel manager. And there's other factors that go into the decision making of what happens and how you get your orchestra on stage or your players. And sometimes, like I said to you earlier, there's a certain demographic that has to be fit. So, you know, I'm constantly balancing that stuff out. And either I don't want to piss people off, pardon my French, but sometimes it's really out of our control. And it's happened to me on multiple tours. But anyway, I just wanted to share that little tidbit.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask one more question, which has to do with just you're a good contractor. And I'm not saying that not all contractors are good, but some of them aren't, right? They're just not great. And some of them are getting really high profile work. And where I saw it was horror stories of musicians saying, oh, you know, I got hired for these 5 dates on the East Coast. I've got to drive myself everywhere. There's no per diem. And the second violin hired me and it's not very much money. And I'm thinking this artist should be working with somebody who is really on top of this. And why is this happening? So I don't know if you have an answer, but like, how is it that some of these artists who are not the Who are getting in bed with contractors who are just not good actors, I guess?
It's usually not the artist. It's the artist management. The artist has no, I mean, I shouldn't say the artist has no clue, but chances are, you know, they're off doing, you know, they're the performer. They're not doing the nitty gritty of what we do. So there are some acts that go around that we all know that are on the AFFM, you know, do not work for a list, and there are certain contractors who are on the unfair list. Even being on the unfair list sometimes doesn't tell the whole story. It really doesn't. And I've had a client who was on the unfair list that I was able to get off of the unfair list when I presented the case of, you know, how this happened. Putting all that aside, I think if you have an honest Jim, you know, an honest person if you have somebody who's particular about filling union contracts or giving your musicians the same thing you would want if you were performing the show, that's key. That's what you want to be doing. And sometimes we do things that are non-union because that's just the circumstance, but we'll still pay the players as if we were taking care of them. And I'm talking in some very small, you know, rural, you know, places where, you know, it's just, you know, they're paying $30 a session, you know, and I'm paying $200. You know, I'm not gonna say no. I'm only gonna pay you that. But I think it's really up to the contractor to say. The hard thing is that we want to say this is what we need, and then they'll say, fine, we'll just go get somebody else. We'll cut corners. So it's just up to our integrity and to our standard of, I don't want my name affiliated with lesser than what I'm doing. And I think that it becomes incumbent on me to make those decisions. And sometimes, like in the early part of my career, at the end of the 80s, I couldn't imagine, why am I not getting better work? Why am I not getting better work? And a very good friend of mine said, because you're still affiliated with the smaller jobs. And when I gave up the smaller jobs, I went broke for a year, but then everybody started calling me after that. Like, then the bigger work came in. I was no longer tied to the lower rung. And then I moved very quickly. So these are kind of tied together, in my opinion. Keep your integrity strong and move up, move yourself up. And sometimes giving up is winning on the other side or moving forward on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, which is that at some point in your career, especially as a freelance musician, right, you're going to have to say no to certain opportunities. And there's power in that if you do it strategically and for reasons that are the right reasons.
It's hard. I remember my days with New Jersey Symphony where I would get called, before I was personnel manager there, I would get called very late sometimes just, you know, to work. Their schedule started on Tuesdays, if I remember right. Sometimes I would get a call on, you know, Sunday afternoon for the following week. And I remember there was one concert I was playing down with the Princeton Symphony, which was a very small group, very good group, but very small. But they were playing the Messiaen, 3 Petite Liturgies. And there's this enormous vibraphone part that I had never played before. And I got paid a fraction of what I would have gotten if I would have worked with the symphony. But I gave the symphony up that week because I wanted to perform the Messiaen. So there it's but I was already working with New Jersey, and I was, you know, and I spoke to the personnel manager and I explained, I said, I need to play this piece. I just need to play it.
Yeah.
Sometimes honesty is that's the best solution. You know? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that it happened more frequently probably in years past, but like folks would leave their Broadway gig to play in the Stanford Symphony, or now it's called Orchestra Lumos, or other regional orchestras, and they wouldn't make as much money, but you know, they're doing it because I've already played, you know, Phantom 700 times and I need to play Beethoven now. So there are times where we make those artistic decisions as well.
It helps keep our sanity, you know, as musicians. And, you know, I don't say that there's anything wrong with doing a Broadway show. I think there's wonderful merit in it. It was never my cup of tea, as I rather have a more diverse chance to play. But I certainly would have said yes to any show I was offered. So I get the balance very well. I really do.
Yeah. So we have a question from a watcher. Jim, did you ever know Andy Kuchak, Secretary Treasurer of Perth Amboy, New Jersey, Local 373, before its merger? I didn't even know that was a local. So
is that in Trenton? Is that
Perth Amboy?
Perth Amboy.
Yeah.
I don't believe I knew a bunch. I knew 373 when they merged, because at the time we were doing work in Red Bank, I believe, and that was the same jurisdiction, if my memory is worth anything. When Count Basie, I was doing a lot of freelance work at Count Basie. And even from the early days, I wanted to do everything via the union. Everything had to be on the up and up. And I realized I was building my reputation, really layering, one layer at a time, one job at a time. And the other thing that I could really encourage people about, speaking about mergers with unions, is that you don't have to make a ton of money on every job. You can make a little bit here and a little bit there. And what it does is it solidifies your position as a contractor when you're not gouging, for lack of a better word, when you're not overcharging in the market. You know, I expect my contractors in the country to charge me about 10% of the overall, fee. If the musician's fee is, say, 30 grand to put it together, I have no problem paying them 10%. The $3 grand to do the work, because it's a hard job, and I recognize that. And we've even done, more than that. But there's kind of a sliding scale of what's it, how I see this working, and I think that it's all kind of joined together via unions merging, via me wanting to be a part of it, me not gouging a price, helping the union helping me, the federation being involved. There's been so many different legs of this. It's been crazy. And doing gigs in multi-cities like Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, using the same orchestra and just, chartering a bus for the 2-hour and 40-minute ride. I save money on a rehearsal and I pay for a sound check. So overall, the company saves money and the musicians still get their money, and it works beautifully. So there's just so many ways to do this, and maybe another book one day just on that. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think it's a great, this has been a really wonderful conversation, and learning so much about the hiring process, right? In different genres of music. So I want to thank you so much for being a guest, and it's been wonderful to have you. And how do people find you if they want to ask you questions or buy your books or connect with you?
Everything's on my website. It's just my name, jimneglia.com. That's it. Everything's on the website that you could possibly imagine. Past shows, present shows, people I've worked with, my books, and just fun. It should just be fun, a website, in my opinion. So that's the way you find me, Michael. Thank you so much for reaching out. And it's been a while, but I found a great picture of the two of us together from Madison Square Garden, I think 2019, back of the Who tour, or one of the tours. You came for a visit, and I snapped a shot, and you look damn snazzy in your blazer.
Oh yeah, me. Yeah, I'm a big fan of blazers. I have about 60 in my closet. It's a sickness.
I remember.
So
well, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, you'll have to send that pic to me. I'd love to have a copy of it.
I'll send it, I promise.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jim. And again, it's JIMNEGLIA.com. And Jim is also on Facebook and other social media platforms if you want to reach out.
That's also on the bottom of the website, like everything you can need, and contact, phone number, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, well, great. And again, so much appreciate you coming on the show this week, and look forward to seeing everybody next week. And thanks again, Jim.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.